Good morning. Welcome to the Asan Plenum 2015. I hope you enjoyed the provocative video that we provided you to provoke your thinking. Before we start, I must, of course, remember the tragedy that is unfolding in Nepal and all those who are suffering. I think 12 countries, including South Korea, have sent rescue teams, and our hearts go out to all those who are suffering from this tragedy. This year we chose as our theme is the U.S. back. Now you can answer that in whichever way you feel. Asan Plenum, this is the fifth incarnation. For those repeat offenders here, I don't need to explain, but for the first-time offenders, the name Asan, we are privileged to be named after a great man who really symbolizes the rise of modern Korea. That is late Chung Ju-young, the founder of the Hyundai business group. And Asan is actually his pen name. Now in Korea, when you're young, you use the names that you're given, but as you get older and when you're more respected, then you have a pen name that others use to refer to you. And Asan is actually, he chose as his pen name the name of this little home village currently now in North Korea, where he hails from. So it's a tiny little hamlet just north of the 38th parallel, at the foot of the Mount Kumgang. He was born into an impoverished farming family in that little town, and of course he came down to Seoul, and of course everything else afterwards, it's as they say, stuff of legend. Of course it was his dream always to go back, to dream and always to try to see what he can do to bring about reunification of the country. So anyways, we are privileged and honored to be named after him, and hence the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. This year's theme, as I said, is we on purpose try to be provocative. It's very interesting when I propose this theme, the people who are most saying, not really, U.S. really isn't coming back, they were mostly Americans. I don't know what that is. Is it modesty, or do you really? Things look somewhat different from the outside world, at least enough so that we wanted to propose this theme for thought and see what, if it isn't, well, first of all, is it really back? And secondly, if it is, what does it really mean for many regions of the world, many countries of the world? Because I think there was a subtle and unspoken, somewhat undefined assumption in the minds of many strategic thinkers that somehow U.S. is, at least in the long term, on some kind of a decline, and how do we really adjust to that? So I think I wanted to see if we can question that assumption and see if what if that assumption is indeed wrong? What does it really mean for all of us? Before we start, I have this most distinct and always the greatest pleasure of introducing to you the founder of our institute, the honorary chairman of our institute, and whose greatest achievement is life, I always tell him, right, is the founding of this institute. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. M.J. Chung.
안녕하십니까. 참석해 주셔서 고맙습니다. 양해해 주시면 영어로 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 재봉 usually put me in good words, partly because we are Johns Hopkins Mafia in Korea. He's a good speaker all the time, but actually he's also a good singer. Next time we'll try. He plays guitar and sings very well. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Asan Plenum. Please allow me to start with a joke that I heard from a Mexican friend, former General Secretary of OECD. One day, President of Mexico said, Mexico is far from God, but too close to the US, and it's a big problem. Later, Prime Minister of Israel said, Israel is very close to God, but too far from the US, and it's a big problem. How about South Korea? South Korea is a deeply religious country with large Christian population. So I can say that Korea is close to God, but too close to Japan, too close to China, and too far from the US, and it's a big problem. Thank you. In the real world, it's not a joke. Today, we face North Korea that is on the verge of acquiring operational nuclear arsenal. 10 years ago, even before North Korea's first nuclear test, Graham Allison, Kennedy School, warned in his book, Nuclear Terrorism, that on the current course, North Korea's development of nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapon production line promises to become the greatest failure in the nearly 230-year history of American foreign policy. Unfortunately, few heeded his warning. Currently, the world's attention seems to be on Iran. In contrast, there seems to be little attention on North Korea's nuclear program. The irony is that North Korea's nuclear program is several years ahead of Iran's. North Korea also continued to develop unconventional warfare capabilities such as cyber warfare, electromagnetic pulse bombs. North Korean cyber attack on Sony has received global attention. However, their attacks on South Korea have been much more extensive and threatening. 2 years ago, North Korea hackers attacked South Korea's leading television networks, such as KBS, MBC, YTN, as well as major financial institutions such as National Agricultural Cooperative Federations and Shinhan Bank. Last year, they also attacked Korea hydro and nuclear power headquarters. In recent months, North Korea has fired more than 20 short-range missiles off its coast. They received scant attention, even from South Korean press. They have become almost routine events. However, former CIA Director James Woolsey warned that North Korea may be testing EMP bombs. North Korea may use one of the missiles to detonate an EMP bomb as part of its quote-unquote routine test firing. An EMP bomb will be a disaster for South Korea, destroying power grids, computers, and electronic devices. A North Korean EMP bomb will be a game changer. This morning, we are all gathered here, but we do not know what the end game of North Korea's nuclear program will be. However, everyone will agree that the current situation cannot continue as it is. The ultimate goal of the Republic of Korea is peaceful unification. It can be a disruptive process even if a war be avoided. As German unification showed, Korean unification can only be achieved with the help of our neighbors, China, Japan, Russia, and US. distinguished guests and friends, if we look at the sheer magnitude of the geopolitics of this vast Eurasian continent, the fact that a small country like South Korea, located at the eastern tip of the continent, remains a free democracy is a miracle in progress. As someone said, the better idea does not have to win just because it is a better idea. It requires great powers to champion it. We are fortunate that the US has been willing to champion our cause. What is the US to Korea? First, it is a country that has no territorial ambition on the peninsula. Second, it is a rare country that tries to balance realism and idealism in its foreign policy, to have its foreign policy reflect an idealistic component. Jaebong used to tell me the US is on its way back. I hope the deliberations of Asan Plenum can help us understand what this means. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MJ, Dr. Chung. Before I ask our keynote speaker to come up to the podium, I have a short message that was sent by Dr. Kissinger, who had originally wanted to come, but at the last minute had to cancel, and he felt bad, and he asked us, what can I do in composition? I said, can you send us a short videotape message on this theme? And so he actually did. So we have about a seven-minute tape recording, which we did in his office in New York 2 weeks ago, which I would now like to play for you.
Let me thank my friends, Dr. M.J. Chung and Dr. Ham Chaibong, for giving me an opportunity to make a few remarks to this important conference. My understanding is that the title of the conference is Is America Back? Of course, there are people who will argue that America never left, and that therefore this is not a subject that requires deep discussion. But it calls attention to a very important challenge of our period. In our time, there are more upheavals going on in more parts of the world than at any previous period in history. Moreover, these events in different parts of the world are connected with each other in a way that has never been the case before. And finally, there are evolutions of great consequence in technology that will change the nature of the interaction of societies with each other, and indeed of people with each other. So the important question is America able to contribute to so many crises simultaneously? I would argue that most of these crises require a significant American contribution. And all of them require some participation by America in their definition and in their execution. In the political field, the most important immediate issue is the number of crises that are occurring in regions such as the Middle East that have different origins and that are occurring simultaneously. But in other parts of the world, the traditional balance of power has shifted to some extent under the impact of a globalized economy and of a advancing technology. Now, first of all, what is the role of America in relation to this? At the end of the Second World War, the United States produced over 50% of the world's gross national product. And therefore, inevitably, it was in a position to dominate the solution of crises by the allocation of its resources. Today, the percentage of the United States gross national product in relation to the rest of the world is between 20 and 25%. That still represents a significant role, but it means that America now has to have a greater understanding of the global consequences of its actions. In the decades ahead, I think it will be seen that what looked like American withdrawal was really a necessity of the United States to redefine its role in the world and to find a new pattern of relationship. And I'm confident that in the decades ahead, it will be seen that the role of America will be different but equally crucial than it has been in the past. The complexity arises because some of the problems within each region have their own momentum. And what must be prevented is that the international system becomes a conflict of regions with each other, because that would inevitably lead to a kind of balance of power conflict that led to World War I. So the United States is inextricably a part of Asia and involved in the Middle East and tied to Europe. But of course, the regions themselves will grow in significance, and the challenge will be how to find patterns of cooperation that are not confrontational, and how to make sure that the requirements of evolution take precedence over the purely confrontational aspects. This is the challenge that your conference faces. It is a very important subject for our period. And the chief message I want to bring is that America will be a major contributor with commitments and ideas to the solution of a world that will evolve peacefully towards greater cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. Amazing. no notes. It's just, we're truly grateful. Now it's time for our first keynote speech. We have two keynote speeches for this plenum, one for today, one for tomorrow. Tomorrow will be His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who will be delivering the keynote speech. For today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you someone that all of you are, I'm sure, very familiar with. It's Ms. Karen House, the former publisher of Wall Street Journal, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, one of the most knowledgeable people about the Middle East. She recently, 3 years ago, published a book on Saudi Arabia that I've read, that many of us have read, which has given us a much far deeper understanding of the country and the region than we had ever been afforded before. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you Ms. Karen House. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Good morning, Dr. Chung, Dr. Hom, Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests. It's a real privilege for me to have this opportunity to address you. I am mindful that I am a very frail substitute for Dr. Kissinger, but I will do my best. Dr. Kissinger, this past year, published another of his remarkable books called World Order. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But unfortunately, and I think Dr. Kissinger does agree, he's just said so in that video, we're looking at a world with an unprecedented degree of disorder. The Middle East is in near chaos as proxy wars between a hegemonic Iran and a beleaguered Saudi Arabia spill from country to country, engulfing Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and most recently, Yemen. An expansionist Russia, having feasted on Crimea, is now, I believe, lusting after the Baltics. If they decide to move on the Baltics, that is obviously poses a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. A military engagement would clearly be extremely costly. To avoid engagement would be even more costly for U.S. credibility in the world. Closer here to Seoul, we see an increasingly assertive China bullying Southeast Asian nations and claiming effective ownership of the South China Sea, expanding its military capability far beyond anything needed for defensive purposes, and labeling the U.S. presence in Asia a Cold War relic that must be removed. In short, China seems to be seeking to eject the U.S. from the region and ultimately to challenge U.S. national interests beyond the region. And if all that isn't enough, we have non-state actors like ISIS and Boko Haram creating mayhem in multiple parts of the world. Whatever degree of global order has existed since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and there have been many times when there was not global order, it is to me clear that there is no global order these days. Now, you might challenge me by saying in Asia and Europe we have good regional order. And obviously, relative to the Middle East, there is order in Asia and Europe. but I would suggest that both Europeans and Asians are whistling past the graveyard. Europe indulges in a form of escapism, expanding its welfare state, dismantling its militaries, and largely ignoring problems around it, even as Mr. Putin encroaches. And here in Asia, the tendency is to focus on the growing trade with China and not on the mounting intimidation by China. So what about the U.S., which ever since World War II has provided, through both Democrat and Republican administrations, has been the primary upholder of a degree of world order. Obviously, this has not been American altruism. It has reflected a deeper understanding in the U.S. that we're not an island, and our own security and prosperity require playing a role in the world abroad. Like me, most of you in this room are old enough to remember that there have been periods when the U.S. shrunk from this responsibility, most notably in the years immediately following America's painful experience in Vietnam. At that time, the country turned inward. Congress cut military spending. It hobbled intelligence gathering. And more broadly, it sought to constrain the president's ability to conduct foreign policy. But in only a half a dozen years later, with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, national confidence was restored, military spending soared, and America faced up to a blustery but brittle Soviet Union and won the Cold War. To me, the problem today with America is rather different from the 1970s, however. For the first time, even including Jimmy Carter, who was a reluctant global leader, we have a president who believes that American power is the cause of most of the world's problems and not the solution. Rather than giving steadfast support to traditional allies, he has become a supplicant on the doorstep of adversaries. His Mideast policy increasingly is the avid pursuit of a deal with Iran in the mistaken impression that history will see his Iran diplomacy as comparable to Nixon's historic opening to China. His determination to diminish America's role in the Middle East is frightening and uniting allies as different as Saudi Arabia and Israel. Similarly, President Obama watches Putin's invasion of Ukraine and declines to provide Ukraine even defensive weapons, are more important to take steps to deter President Putin's focus on the Baltics. The aim, of course, is not to seek a military confrontation with Russia, but precisely the opposite. My former colleague, Brett Stevens, who has a new book called America in Retreat, says that the role of America should be that akin to a policeman on the block, that it is in walking the beat, he reassures the good, deters the tempted, and punishes the wicked. And that, of course, is the concept of a tripwire, which has helped to protect South Korea here for the past 6 decades. Our president continues to put great faith in dialogue, even though it seems to me little has come of it so far. Shaking hands with Raul Castro is not a foreign policy. So, and I know this may sound harsh, if Teddy Roosevelt said we should speak softly and carry a big stick, this president seems to prefer to use a loud microphone and carry a twig. having drawn a red line in Syria and then unilaterally abandoned it, drawing another red line against Putin, of course, wouldn't have any credibility unless backed with troops, and that seems to be something the president is determined to avoid. But the refusal to protect the Baltics actually invites aggression, which, as I noted earlier, would be costly to confront and even more costly if we failed to confront it. If the Saudis and Israelis and Taiwanese and South Koreans, the Poles and other U.S. allies are worried about our constancy now, think what they would think after the failure of NATO to respond to a move on the Baltics. Closer to home here, your home, President Obama's pivot to Asia has actually turned out to be something of a pirouette. Rather than facing up to regional and increasingly global challenge from China, our administration is largely ignoring it, are encouraging Japan to play a larger role in East Asia security, which clearly has an unsettling impact on our South Korean allies. Rather than seeking to balance China's growing assertiveness with a strong, clear foreign policy and a military strategy to back it up, we are allowing the balance of military power in this part of the world to shift by pretending that a policy of seeking to integrate China into a liberal world order is a goal that China shares, despite strong evidence to the contrary. I don't think China's goal is to be a junior member in a G2 marriage. As Henry Kissinger noted in describing the traditional Sino-centric system, China, he wrote, considered itself, in a sense, the sole sovereign government of the world, wherein the emperor's purview was not simply a sovereign state of China, but all under heaven. All under heaven means all of us. There's a new study out by the Council on Foreign Relations which starkly warns that the U.S. should craft a new response to the growing intimidation in particularly Asia of China. The report says that Washington's, quote, current approach toward Beijing, one that values China's economic and political integration in the liberal international order at the expense of the United States' global preeminence and long-term strategic interests, hardly amounts to a grand strategy, let alone an effective one, and then calls for a more coherent U.S. response. Obviously, everyone wants a world in which China, the U.S., all of us prosper, but hoping for it without planning for it is not wise, is the point of that report. So why is this administration largely a bystander in foreign affairs? I think the Obama administration genuinely believes that foreign affairs are a distraction from the more important domestic priorities. The president's goal is to remove us from the world, not to lead the world. And that's a very different philosophy for a U.S. president. Displaying U.S. power in the president's mind, I think, is a distraction from income redistribution at home, so that he sees all of these events as a zero-sum game, which I clearly do not. But the truth is that as much as idealists might wish it to be otherwise, I think there is no alternative for U.S. leadership if the goal is to preserve the liberal world order that we know. The idea being peddled in the U.S. that you have to choose between fixing problems at home or having influence abroad is a false and truly dangerous dichotomy. If you repaint and refurbish your home in a dangerous neighborhood, it doesn't do much to guarantee that it won't be vandalized or destroyed. You have to work on changing the neighborhood to guarantee your home is secure. For proof of this proposition, if you look at Europe, the more the European nations focus on expanding their welfare states and coddling their citizens, the less inclined and less capable they are to resist external threats. Indeed, even as Putin threatens his neighbors, the Europeans convince themselves, as they did before World War II, it can't happen here. So is the U.S. inevitably headed in that same direction? And my short answer is no. If you recall, this is not, as the video pointed out, the first time the U.S. has been weak and vacillating. In the years leading up to both world wars, America sought to hide behind its oceans. Much more recently, as mentioned, Jimmy Carter pursued an Obama-like foreign policy, avoiding the use of U.S. power and simply preaching peaceful virtues and values. Even Carter, of course, reversed himself when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the Iranians took American hostages. That reversal was then accelerated by President Reagan, so that in less than 4 years, Carter's malaise turned into Reagan's shining city on a hill. We went from paralysis over hostage-taking to what you heard President Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We went from America in retreat to winning the Cold War. An optimist would argue that the U.S., given all its underlying strengths, can return to a role of true global leadership quickly if it makes up its mind to do so. The underlying American economy remains far and away the strongest, even if hampered by budget deficits and debt. American innovation is alive and well, even if frustrated by overregulation. American higher education remains the best in the world, even if our secondary education seems resistant to improvement. An American ability to attract and assimilate waves of immigrants remains a strength that constantly injects new enterprise and new energy into the whole society. And this is true notwithstanding the issues and controversy on our southern border. An American military strength, diminishing under the weight of sequestration and a president who prefers domestic spending, still remains the most effective in the world. If you want a lot of good statistics on America's role, you can read the Pax Americana 3.0 put out by the Asan Institute. In 1989, I wrote a controversial series for the Wall Street Journal when much of the conventional wisdom was that we were falling behind Japan, just as today it is that we are slipping behind China. And based on reporting, a year's worth of reporting, I argued that this was nonsense for many of the reasons just stated. I was an optimist at a time when most people were deeply pessimistic about America. Now, the pessimists these days say, yes, but things are very different than they were 25 years ago. They point out that the U.S. lacks a cohesive set of ideas and values that we can rally around in times of need and ask Americans to sacrifice. They argue that the national demographics of America are changing dramatically and that this diversity is somehow damaging to us. And they argue that the steadily growing number of people who are dependent on government largesse means that more and more Americans are asking, what can the government do for me? Not the famous John Kennedy query, what can I do for my country? And a pessimist further would point out that the US government seems to be badly broken. But I still remain more an optimist than a pessimist. I truly believe that there's absolutely nothing wrong with America that strong, decisive leadership couldn't fix. A leader who genuinely put America's future first could, I believe, reverse these negative trends, restore bipartisanship to foreign policy. We mustn't live with this myth that there used to be great bipartisanship in foreign policy. There has been at times and there has not been, but we could have enough bipartisanship to have a functional foreign policy. Such leadership emerging from either political party would summon what is best in Americans. Rather than indulging Americans in the false belief that you can have a risk-free life in a risk-free world if we just stay, stay at home and mind our own business. We would summon them back to individual responsibility and global responsibility and teach Americans, as previous generations learned, that we cannot enjoy comfortable and prosperous lives in a world dominated by powers antithetical to our liberal values. That is not, in my view, simply idealism, it is realism. So I close exactly where Dr. Kissinger did by, again, summing up what he just said, that America will be a major contributor with commitments and ideas to the solutions of a world that will evolve peacefully towards greater cooperation. That's what the U.S. wants, and I think that's what all of us should want, is a cooperative cooperation among all of us to enhance the peace, prosperity, and security of all of us. Thank you for your attention.